Hello and welcome to I think week 13 of the PAF podcast. Coming along now nicely, I think I'm on a roll here. My overall thought process behind my content is becoming a lot more realized, and I think I have a lot more consistency in what type of ideas I want to cover now that I'm done covering all the bases I really want to. But that doesn't mean I'm still not, or that doesn't mean I'm not open to new ventures to go to. Of course, I'm always expanding my content, always looking for new avenues. So, topic for this week is why the idea of a Greek tragedy doesn't exist in anime specifically. And I think this is a pretty interesting question because if you really think about it, there's a lot of shows that try to introduce tragedy into its narrative and into its characters, but there's no like specific correlation with a Greek tragedy like Oedipus or something like that. And this whole idea of tragedy, I think, is kind of built behind all of our ideas of early literature and how we all interacted with Shakespeare's work because it kind of revolves around a lot of his stories. Romeo and Juliet is the most famous one we learn. Hamlet as well. It all revolves around how we view the tragedy and how it interacts with us and our psyches, and whether we think it's tragic or not that the so-called quote-unquote heroes of the story perish usually. And this is, somewhat true when we talk about anime. There are anime where it's kind of building up to the hero's tragic end, but there's no like element to Greek mythology or something I'd correlate it with that I think really strikes me as something like Oedipus. And if you haven't read Oedipus, I don't think I should probably spoil it. But like here's the basic gist of Oedipus if you don't really care to read it. Oedipus is a dude who meets a sphinx and does like this puzzle, I guess, and then accidentally screws his mom, and then wants to he gouges his eyes out and stuff like that, and he just ends up doing a lot of wrong stuff, and there's some moral ending to it or whatever. It's not really the point of why I'm doing this, right? It's because tragedy is just so hard to nail for I think Japanese culture in general. Our idea of tragedy is kind of divergent from English tragedy, while Japanese tragedy is kind of divergent from the idea of honor, and it's tragic to lose your honor in Japanese culture. I mean, I'm not trying to like say that their entire society revolves around an honor-based system. I'm merely saying that honor and reputation means a lot to them, more so than a lot of other countries, I would say. And I'm saying this in in an overarching nature where most Asian countries really see themselves as they want to preserve their standing because that's really all they have. Most of these Asian countries are third world and don't really have a lot, so the only thing they can preserve is their pride and how they interact with the other countries around them. And that's why I think the Japanese struggle to write tragedy so often, because it just feels so pale in comparison to what is being said through a English or Greek tragedy, while in Japanese tragedy it's usually just someone dying and without all the weight to it. And I think that a lot of these stories don't ever cover like the fall from grace, as I usually like to call it. Usually, like in stories like Julius Caesar, you'll see someone of great power and magnificent be betrayed by their own subordinates, and it's a kind of just elegant fall from power, and you just don't have this in anime because they just don't experience that. They're run by quote unquote emperor. I don't think the emperor has any control over lawmaker or anything. It's just for looks, but they just don't have that type of interaction with their culture. And I think the content they produce suffers because of it greatly, because they're just not accustomed to a lot of the nuances that are presented through the Greek tragedy. um I do want to cover a couple. I think I have like one show that really kind of just experiments with the idea of a Greek tragedy in anime. I think. Oh, what is the show? It starts with Kanajo, but or it starts with or ends with Kanajo, but it's basically a romantic show where eventually the girl dies at the end, boohoo, whatever. But it does experience with or experiment with the idea that this girl who is so powerful and smart and elite, I should say, and then falls to the peasantry of simplicity and stuff like that, and then learns to humility through it, but then dies tragically. I think a couple of Ghibli movies do it right too. A rather notable one is Graveyard of the Fireflies. It's rather tragic in the nature of the deaths in that movie, but I don't think it's tragic in the fact that there are deaths. I just think it's tragic in the fact that the story is told to be a tragedy, which I don't think is kind of the right move. I mean, it's still a good movie, don't get me wrong, but in the essence of like a Greek tragedy, I don't think it's supposed to be set up to be tragic from the very beginning because in like Hadanashi no Gen, which is another Hiroshima movie, uh, in like the first 30 minutes, there's already a tragedy, and you kind of don't expect it. It's supposed to be sort of unexpected, but like also foreshadowed. And the whole buildup of Hadanashi no Gen is sort of like, they're a thriving family. They're a one of the people that you'd be like neighbors with and have a really good relationship with and like share food with sometimes. And then the tragedy strikes, and then continually throughout the story they build up happiness again, and then tragedy strikes again, which is kind of not very, it's just not executed correctly to the point where I'd say like it exceeds as a piece because of the tragic elements to it, which is hard to nail. Albeit it's just a really hard concept to nail. Not just because it's Japanese culture, but it's just because tragedy is so overused today and saturated by a lot of media. Especially if you look at I saw this one post comparing Marvel's Iron Man's death to a Greek tragedy, and I read it and I was like, I mean, this is not a substantiated argument. I just don't see this being like the fall of a great entity. I mean, sure, he was Tony Stark was sort of a quote unquote great entity in the fact that he performed great acts, but he was never a great person. I don't think he made the right decisions for the sake of humanity and for the sake of his family, but he doesn't really seem like a heroic figure, unfortunately. At least in my opinion, I think Captain America kind of is a thesis on heroism in general. But yeah, I think that Ghibli does it best when it comes to experimenting with the idea of tragedy because usually, even though most of them are like quote unquote children's movies, like there are tragic moments in these movies where people die. People do die in these movies, and there's a lot of nuance to how those deaths come apart, but they're all centered around the fact that they want to make you, you know, throb, heart throb, I guess. What else? Uh, does I don't really know if Greek tragedy or Greek mythology or Greek history really has an influence on Eastern culture a lot. I think it definitely has a huge influence on Western culture for sure. We take a lot of our ideas from I think the most overused one nowadays is the idea of King Midas and greed because everyone likes shiny stuff, and the heist movies that come out now and then are kind of centered around the greed and ambition behind stealing stuff and becoming Midas essentially. While in Eastern culture you kind of have it just seems to be the opposite. They don't really have a lot. There's greed is just not built into their culture. Ambition isn't really built in their culture either. They're just set to do a job and do it correctly, and they don't really have to excel because no one's expecting them to excel. Usually in Western culture, you're usually supposed to go up and up and up to the point where you can't go up any farther, and then your children carry it on. In Eastern culture, you're just kind of just in that same rut. I think another show that kind of comes close to this idea of the tragic, or the Greek tragedy, is kind of Berserk in a way, because it manages to create multiple people that none of them really have gratifying endings, and the series isn't even over yet. But let's just consider the 1997 here for a second. All of these protagonists, which are of which there are three, they end up more or less the way they would have been, and it's all albeit very tragic the way they end in the series, because all of them just kind of lack the identity that they were before, and will probably never be like that again. And I don't really think it really exemplifies how a real tragedy is supposed to operate. Not to say there's like a real tragedy. I'm just saying, like, in the Western tragedies, it usually doesn't end up where all the protagonists are just stripped of everything that made them, human. But more so, I think the approach was they were stripped of everything that made them not human, and then they become even more primal because of it. I mean, Guts kind of ends up as a beast of darkness, which is kind of exemplary of our primal instinct to like conquer and explore, I guess. Casca kind of returns to a shell of herself, and kind of becomes like the symbol of innocence and like infant. How do you say it? It's like an infantry. I don't know. And then Griffith obviously becomes like an idea of how humans are obsessed with power, and then will become consumed by it, and then that's their only instinct from there on forth. And yeah, you just have a lot of these shows just not. I mean, don't get me wrong, it wasn't even going for that. It was trying to just go for a more badass way of storytelling. But uh, let's get into the existence of why I think that no one will try to tackle this concept, especially studios in the modern age, because tackling this is quite the daunting task, especially if there's not a lot of background to go on. Usually, when someone wants to make a clever product, or like a great product, they have to take influence from several places. I mean, if you look at Christopher Nolan's films, he's taken a lot of influence from really older directors, Stanley Kubrick. I don't think he takes any influence from people like Quentin Tarantino, especially in his writing, because he's more fantastical in nature, while Tarantino's is a lot more grounded and character based. Although that you could make the argument that his are more character based, I think it's more on the spectacle of his world Christopher Nolan tries to focus on. That's why I think he's a great director, because I think the world played a large part into making a movie seem more realistic or more fantastical. And he has a couple tragic arcs to his characters. You could say that Batman's arc is quite tragic in nature, especially in the second movie, because in the end he quite loses. He doesn't die, but he loses the psychological battle, and if you ask Freud, he definitely lost. But yeah, you just can't really draw, and most directors, like if you ask I don't know who's a modern director today that is pretty popular. Let's just say someone from Studio UFO Table, right? Tried to imitate something like Julius Caesar or Oedipus, and he was like, but there's nothing to go on here. I have nothing to go on. Like, there's nothing like critically acclaimed that I can really watch or read from a manga and be like, this is great source material that I can build off of, or this is. I'm sure there's like work that I'm missing here, or work that I'm not thinking of, but I'm just saying the lack of it doesn't really help to make a strong argument to why this concept doesn't exist. And these directors just won't tackle it, or writers just won't tackle it in general, because they just don't have the key fundamentals of understanding Western tragedies separated from Eastern tragedies. And that's kind of goes to show like how I don't want to say that Western tragedies are better in nature. I'm just saying that like it would probably appeal more to the Western audience if it was done that way. And it's just not even that. Like they're not even trying. Like the West could they don't really care about the West when it comes to producing content. They're producing content for the Eastern because that's where the big bucks come in. We're not watching it on TV. We're watching it on streaming services that are licensed by certain corporations like Crunchyroll or whatever. But they just don't tackle these ideas because they're just not. One, they can't dissect the ideas behind it because it's just not ingrained into their culture, and two, there's just not a lot of source material they can base anything off of unless they're familiar with Western material. And I know that a lot of directors watch like the comic book movies because they're nerds or whatever, and they try to derive their understanding of the tragedy from that, but it's just not enough. It's just not enough to understand tragedy through just like the Marvel movies or something. You have to dig deeper than that and really, find the core fundamentals of why these stories are so venerated across the years. Like there's a reason that students in high school still read Julius Caesar, Hamlet, and Romeo and Juliet. It's because they're just stories that mean a lot to understanding how we read literature. And some people might argue against this idea. Some people might say that we shouldn't really force the East to gain a better understanding because that kind of takes away from the originality of why we think the East is so good in terms of their content being produced. And sure, that's a fair argument. The East, without producing this type of tragic, westernized influence on Greek tragedies or whatever, is beneficial to them in terms of content. They make a lot of money through their entertainment industry, and entertainment is the biggest industry in their culture at the moment. But, it would be nice if they did it. This is all sort of a criticism and suggestions box, but, I think it would be nicer if I saw something like that, and it would be a lot more. I would understand if there are flaws in a series that was produced under that lens because there's nothing really to go off of. There's not a lot of shows that really can say I base this off of a Greek tragedy and the structure of this show is based off such, because like no one tries to recreate anything of that sort because it's just not popular. They want to see older IPs, magical girls or whatever. They want to see older stuff in their culture, not from our culture, because in our culture we're reading Shakespeare, they're reading something else most likely in their education systems. Um, and usually the tone of most series are a lot more uplifting, I should say. They're more moe, as the culture, suggests. And that's another reason why this idea doesn't exist, is because it doesn't make money to make a show like this. It doesn't really profit them in any way when they can make a moe show a lot more easily and with less effort to the production quality of it, while pouring resources into building a really in-depth and high-class story doesn't really pay off because who's going to watch it? I mean, you can't really put your finger on how many of the adult population watches shows like that, and you also can't really point a finger to the younger generation because they're more obsessed with shows like Demon Slayer or something like that. But there was this interesting poll I saw by this one dude who just walks around and asks random people their tastes in shows, and their tastes, the Japanese taste in shows is actually really devoid of what we consider tasteful in the United States. A lot of people's favorite shows are just super just niche things like Kimono Friends. In the U.S., that was taken as a really unpopular show because of its CGI, but in the East, it was super popular. Kimono Friends is absolutely just an amazing show to them. Just like hands down, like 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, easily. And that's kind of the difference between how we view stuff here. We just kind of want more grounded and less whimsical material. I mean, we still want the whimsical element of the absurd element, like fighting dragons and wizards and stuff like that. But we want it to be grounded in nature with a story that makes sense to us. While in their culture, they kind of just want a good time, sort of like that. I mean, we both want a good time, but their idea of a good time is different from us vastly. Um, because if you look at a show like Kimono Friends, they don't really have the production quality of gods among men. They really just have the production quality they're given, and they work with what they've got. And to that extent, it's popular because of the content of the show, and the content of the show makes up for the lack of production quality, which they obviously don't care about, which we all care about in the U.S. We care about content and production quality, while in the East they care about production quality, but not as much as us. They care about more so the characters, of course. They're not really obsessed with the idea that every show should be a serious critique on human morality or something like that. I don't think that it really centers around it. Um, and we might be obsessed with the idea of sons that wish to kill their fathers, because some revenge story just sounds more just sounds more appealing than watching you know girls drink tea in a you know band and play songs. It's just not appealing to us. I mean, that was kind of a bad example, but I think you get the gist of what I'm trying to assume here. Uh, you know, I really think that this idea of the Greek tragedy tries to embrace a tone of, anticipation and just like humbleness. What is it? Humble. Feel like there's another word for humble. Humility. Yeah. And it's supposed to show that you should be, fine with your position, which is coinciding with their culture. Like, most of these stories end up tragedies because the main character usually wants something more or less. In the case of like, I don't know, someone who wants to seek enlightenment, they're a rich dude that wants to seek enlightenment, so they have to live as life as a peasant, and then they die because of it, and they never reach enlightenment, and more so experience more pain than they could have just staying rich. And all these stories usually end up with the moral lesson that you should be fine with your own position and be fine with the lifestyle you currently possess, because it just poses an inconvenience to those around you, and that coincides with their culture a lot. It's very stay where you are and don't be an inconvenience to others, because it will disrupt your reputation and disrupt your honor. So yeah, I feel like with that in mind, there should be a lot more shows that really hammer that idea into you and start building on top of it, so that other directors have more source material to go off of. This is the perfect time to experiment with stuff, because since we are in this age of the Rona, and you know some studios are expected to have less quality products because the manpower and the resources are just not there. This is the perfect time to experiment with these ideas, and perfect time to really test out what works and what doesn't, and also to build background so that other people can work off of it and somehow make a better product because of it. and you won't be criticized too harshly because you lack the manpower and support to really produce a great product right now. And I think that is basically my whole thesis on the subject. I think yeah, pretty fascinating stuff. And in conclusion, uh yeah, I just want to see more of it, and I think it would be very beneficial to the overall scope of the content of what is compared to what's coming out now. Like, please, I'll take anything right now over what is coming up right now. Um, yeah, I just think it'll be very beneficial, especially if it's a serious show. A lot of people seem to really like serious shows nowadays, so it's perfect for this kind of climate we're in. A lot of people are just really down to earth and understanding of you know the work that goes into making these shows, and are really appreciative of what comes out. That is, unless you're returning IP like My Hero, where a level of quality is already assumed. If it's a new show, then there's no bar set, so you can only go up from here, unless you don't want to go down, which then you'd be My Hero. Where you go up, then you go down, and probably never resurface, because I don't know if Yutaka Nakamura is working on that show anymore. And that's a Greek tragedy on its own. Yutaka Nakamura not working on a Bone show is just a cardinal sin. And I think the show obviously suffered because of it. Because I'm pretty sure it got poo-poo reviews. And yeah, that is about it.